One. Hi, I'm Stephen Sawchuk, an associate editor with Education Week. I'm here with three of my great colleagues. We just wrapped up our live summit on early reading, and what we're going to do here is kind of just talk a little bit about the things that came up in each of our little booths. So it's a good chance for you to get some takeaways, and obviously the transcripts will be there for you to go back in. But I think this will just help kind of hone in on some of the stuff that we found the most interesting and that the reporting series really generated in the field. So I'll just do quick introductions. In purple, furthest away from me, is Sarah Schwartz, who covers curriculum. Next to her is Maddie Will, who covers the teaching profession. Next to me is Sarah Sparks, who is our expert research reporter. And I contributed to the report, although technically I cover school districts. So I'm going to start by asking Maddie a question about what people talked about in her booth. And that is there was a lot of concern that pre-service teaching programs are not committed to or not knowledgeable about sort of what we really know about how students learn to read in K through 2, so in very early ages. Can you just tell us a little bit about, what was the discussion about? What were the sticking points that people were pointing out with respect to pre-service education?
Yeah, so I framed the conversation around EdWeek's survey that we surveyed about 530 professors of early reading courses, and we found that 22% said their philosophy of teaching early reading was explicit, systematic phonics instruction with comprehension as a separate focus. And that's really what the research shows is, the most effective way on teaching students how to learn. 57% of professors said their philosophy was balanced literacy, and 4% said they favored a whole language approach. So my booth was people were really curious about why some of these professors and some of these teacher preparation programs were not necessarily embracing some of the cognitive research of reading.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sense that that's partly because the education and then the sort of psychology, neuroscience divisions are, typically really separate on campus, right? It's not like you walk down the hall. So
right, yeah.
There's siloing.
I think that might be part of it. A lot of what people were saying in my booth was that, a lot of teacher educators might not know all of the latest research on reading, and they might not have been trained in it themselves when they were going through their doctorate programs and their master's programs. So it's, you don't know what you don't know, and, you have to learn how to do it, and it can be tough if you've been teaching something for 20 plus years and then you find out that might not be aligned with the current research.
In fact, one of our findings from our study showed that post-secondary instructors, almost half of them, about 42% said that what they learned about reading didn't come from PD or from their actual classroom teaching. It came from other, and a lot of them said it came from my graduate school program. So in other words,
Right.
their knowledge was being transmitted by other people who were perhaps, who came up through the ranks during periods where other philosophies, balanced literacy, whole language,
Right.
were in vogue. So
So it's kind of like a cycle. And what my expert guests were saying in my discussion was that you really need to start at the top and train these faculty members on what they need to know about teaching reading.
Now, of course, somebody in my booth brought something up really interesting, which I hadn't thought about, which is that you can't actually force, like if I'm the dean, right? Like I can ask you to put research on your syllabus. I can, I could maybe incentivize you to do it through grants, but I can't actually like force you to put any one specific thing on a syllabus, right?
Yeah, academic freedom.
Academic freedom. There you go.
Professors can control what they teach.
Right. And I think in K through 12 we forget that sometimes, right? Because the school board ultimately decides what's going to be taught, and everyone follows along. So let's ask Sarah Short. A lot of our discussion has focused on decoding, right? Like word identification on the page, but we know that that's not the only aspect of early reading that matters. And so your discussion was really about the comprehension side of the equation. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of the themes that people in your booth we're interested in?
Sure. So broadly, when we're talking about these two separate sides of the equation, the sort of decoding, more foundational skills side and the comprehension side, those two are part of an equation that is known as the simple view of reading. And people who have read our report will be familiar with this, so sorry if I'm saying things that you already know, but the simple view of reading says that reading comprehension is the product of these two things, of language comprehension and of your decoding ability. And so if one of those is low, your reading comprehension will be low, because 0 times anything is 0. So that's sort of just like a foundation for this conversation. But in terms of what came up in the booth, one thing that we sort of got into a productive discussion about was the difference between a skills-based and a knowledge-based or a content-based curriculum. And one of our expert guests, Margaret McCune, who's a reading researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, she said skills-based has got to go. We need to do a content building curriculum. And sort of the difference there is that a skills-based curriculum is focused on building skills. So things like finding the main idea or describing characterization. And while, teachers are still putting thought into what texts they're using to teach those skills, it's not necessary that every teacher in every classroom is using the same text. And a content or a knowledge building curriculum takes sort of different approach, where it's very important that certain knowledge is being built sequentially. So, for example, a unit around different types of plants, or a unit around Greek myths, and delivering that content is very important. And so Margaret McCune said we need to be doing this content building curriculum, but some teachers chimed in and said, well, that's really difficult because the tests are asking me to make sure that my students know how to use these skills. And if we're not talking about the skills explicitly in class, will they be able to understand how to do something like find the main idea when they're asked to do that on a test? And so sort of a compromise that was reached was...
Oh, you had a detente in
we
your
did.
booth.
Yeah,
That's very
we did.
exciting.
We
okay.
did. Was that you could talk authentically about texts and ask questions about specific content, have students throw out different answers and not sort of say that there was one right or wrong answer. But then you can come back to that and say, remember when we were talking about sort of what this story is about and what these characters represent? Well, that's main idea. And you're going to have to do that again on a standardized test. And so that way it links the concept that the students will see on the test with work that is perhaps more meaningful in a classroom.
I mean, it seems to me that you would spend some limited amount of time on this passage is generally about Aphrodite or Athena or whatever, right? But then the more interesting part of the class would be comparing, I don't know, the role of female goddesses, relative to the way Greek women were treated or something like that, right? But just something richer.
Right, and then the idea is at the end of that, you don't have to even explicitly be talking about main idea because students will understand what that is from the content knowledge that they have about Greek goddesses.
Right.
And they'll from that comparing process, they'll sort of know what we're talking about.
Now, putting together text sets that, so to extend your example, right? So you have mythology, but you're also teaching Greek culture, and you're probably teaching history and geography along with that. The difficulty is coming up with the right set of related reading materials. That's one of the challenges.
Yeah, I think so. There are emerging now some commercial curricula that are trying to do this. Then there are also, individual schools or individual districts that are trying to do this. Just for reporting for this story and for other stories that I've done, I think teachers say this is very challenging because it takes a lot of time to intentionally build something this way.
There's not a lot of nonfiction for younger grades either, right? I mean, because we tend to traditionally to have taught fiction. So finding nonfiction at the right level of, what would you call it, text complexity, right? Or lexile level is difficult, from what I understand.
Absolutely.
I'm going to ask Sarah a question, but first I'm going to say your booth was packed. I mean, hundreds of comments. And your booth was on what do we know? Really, I mean, the most basic question of all, and the thing that prompted us to do this reporting, what do we know about reading? What do you conclude from that? Just the sheer number of people that wanted an answer to that question.
Well, and what's interesting is when they came in, there were some very basic questions like, so what do we know about K2 reading? Which fortunately we have that great explainer and all of our great reporting on the subject. But a lot of people, the deeper question was, okay, what does this look like for my kids? What does teaching phonics mean when I have English language learners? Which is really interesting because the research is slightly different. When you have children whose language is not English, who might have different sounds that they were born hearing, and so
the phonemes in
right,
Spanish
their
are
phonemes
different
are different, right, and require more instruction in translating that over. And talking about how does this apply now that our children are learning in digital formats? Will this be helpful? Will this hurt them in their literacy? So a lot of research questions really turn into implementation questions, and does this research really apply to me? And one of the good things about having so many people involved in that discussion is we had a lot of people who were saying, oh, well, over here's how we're doing it. And I tried this, but it didn't really work for me, but you should try this program over here. So it was a lot of great sharing of ideas and research. And we're also going to be posting additional links, because just trying to keep up with everybody's questions, we will still need to add some additional research links for those.
So to summarize, knowing that systematic explicit phonics, which we know is, a well-supported, an evidence-based way to teach reading, does not automatically, magically create a lesson plan that helps you to do that with the scope and sequence.
Right. And doesn't show you how to make a motivating, engaging, fun classroom lesson. And I think we had some conversation about pushback from teachers or parents and how do you deal with that. And some of the conversation was just around the difference between convincing someone about the research and what's the research base versus convincing someone that you can do a lesson that isn't boring. Or you can do a lesson
I'm sold on phonics, but now I want to make it not a worksheet.
Right. It includes both comprehension and phoneme awareness.
Yeah, one thing that I remember when Sarah did her great research explainer was...
And Sarah,
that's right. It's difficult because we have Sarah Schwartz, Sarah Sparks, Steven Sawchuk. It's like the SS crew here.
Not quite.
Okay. Well, we all go by middle initials in the office, actually. But anyway. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is that sometimes people would email us and they would want a recipe. Like, how many minutes do I spend on this? How many minutes on let's say, phonemic manipulation? How many minutes do I spend on phonics? How many minutes do I then spend on oral language development for some of the comprehension skills that Sarah Schwartz was talking about? And that we don't know, right? Like down to fractions of the school day, how much you do.
Right. We know that a lot of the studies have looked at average lessons of about 25 minutes. And we know there's been some evidence that more than 20 hours, there's some diminishing returns, if I'm getting that correct. But there really isn't a die hard, you need this many minutes at this time of day. And in fact, being really super over prescriptive is one of the things that tends to get people at each other's throats a little bit.
I wanted to bring one finding actually from the survey that in my booth we talked the most about, and I'll actually be curious to hear what you think about it. But when we did our survey, we asked both teachers and higher ed professors who are teaching reading methods to say where they learned most of what they know about reading. And one thing that I found very surprising was that both of them said, like very few of them cited their own pre-service training, right? So these are teachers, only 5% said that what they know about reading came from their certification programs. So where was it coming from? It was coming from professional development, which is, like what they're getting actually once they're in the classroom, whatever the district gives them. Personal experiences, curriculum and programs, presumably the ones that are in their classrooms. And to me, this is kind of great, because we often talk about, teacher prep doesn't really know this stuff as well as it ought to, but that's not where teachers say they're getting it. So what do we make of the fact that they're really getting it after they've already, have their certificate and they're in the classroom?
Well, that's one area that we talked about in our booth as well, is that even if teacher preparation is teaching pre-service teachers how to teach reading aligned with the research, if they go into a school where the curriculum is not aligned with research, if their mentor teachers are not teaching reading aligned with the research, they're going to revert back to that. And it won't matter necessarily what the pre-service programs taught. So you have to,
silence your phone. You have to silence your phone.
And figure out how to balance that.
It's worth noting that Mississippi, which had some very strong gains in reading on the NAEP this year, they credited some of those gains to statewide teacher professional development, which I believe some of the base of that was science of reading related training. So you can argue about how much of a role that actually played, but it at least points to the fact that support from district or state funding can really help with that sort of thing.
Though theoretically it's also costly, right? Because you're in effect retraining people who, maybe they were taught that way in pre-service, but often they weren't. So,
well, Mississippi is actually doing a two-pronged approach where they're doing the professional development. They're also training the faculty in pre-service programs.
Okay. So there's alignment there between pre-service and service.
How many states are doing that? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
So I'm going to ask one more question here about techniques, and this came up a lot in my booth. In our survey, we found that most teachers said that when students came to an unfamiliar word, they told them to sound it out, which is, of course, what you would say in a research-based phonics-oriented program. However, most of them also said that they were using what's called the cueing systems to help learn reading. And these two practices don't actually complement each other well. So what does that tell us about classroom practice and where we need to go next?
Oh, okay. Everyone's looking.
Everyone's looking.
Well, I think so. I think what it means is that a lot of this is really detailed and really at the level of what an individual teacher is doing in the classroom every day. So just to give a really brief overview of cueing. So also it's also known as MSV, and it stands for meaning, structure, and visual. And the idea is that when you come to a word you don't know, you can use the meaning, like the pictures in the story, or the rest of the meaning of the sentence to figure out that word. You can use the sentence structure, so like whether you think that there should be a verb there, to figure out the meaning of that word, or you can use visual clues, which would mean letters. So you can, even within MSV, the V for visual, that is looking at the letters, that's sounding it out. But if you're teaching all these things in connection, it can be very confusing. Students can know that they don't have to sound it out if they don't want to or if they can't.
So the argument against cueing is that like you may take your attention off of print because you're looking at the pictures or for one of these other
Right.
cues. Okay.
Right. And a lot of these strategies are deeply embedded in the curriculum programs that teachers are using, which goes back to what Maddie said about when teachers aren't getting in their pre-service programs, it means that the curriculum matters a lot, because that's where teachers are learning the strategies that they need to be using in class.
Did that question come up in your comprehension?
So very briefly, it was actually one teacher said that it was sort of actually making the distinction between using the meaning of a story to figure out what a word says versus using the meaning of a story to figure out what a word means.
Right.
And so using the meaning of a story to figure out what a word says, that means you're not looking at the letters to figure out how to pronounce it. But most of us use the meaning.
Yeah, if you come across
right.
an unfamiliar word, but we already know how to decode, right?
Right,
We could
right.
already
So-
sound out, we could identify the word.
Yes. So if you're, for example, if you're reading Harry Potter and you come across the word muggle, you can decode the word muggle because you know
A good decodable word.
it is. It really is, because you know the letters and what sounds they correspond to. You don't know what the word muggle means, and so you have to either rely on the author of the story to explain that to you, or you can use context clues to figure out what that word means. Although in our comprehension booth we did talk about how using context clues may not be the most effective way to figure out what a word means for the first time, to first learn its
Interesting.
definition.
Right.
It's interesting because now I know why someone came over and explicitly asked in my booth how people would approach dealing with a student who didn't know a word. That was actually asked in my booth, and everyone told them to sound it out.
Right.
And actually, we ended up talking a little bit about the importance of also using verbally talking about the meaning of the word, verbally discussing words and adding background knowledge, and allowing the kids opportunities to connect their own background knowledge and their oral vocabulary as they're learning to sound out words, because knowing the meaning allows them to remember the words that they're learning faster. They actually map those faster than if they are just learning random sounds.
And research shows us that discussing words in context is a much more effective way to learn vocabulary than just trying to memorize a definition.
Right.
Oh, to do the long lists?
Yes.
I did a lot of long lists back in the day, let me just tell you. So, well, I don't want to keep everyone for too long, but I did want to remind people watching this that we have a lot of information. I mean, this is a very in-depth reporting series that we did and continue to do, and it's called Getting Reading Right. We have the survey that I mentioned that is one of the first national gauges, frankly, that we have of what's actually happening with teachers and pre-service educators. We have the wonderful explainer that Sarah and Sarah put together on research, and Maddie, of course, is our expert on all things related to how we're teaching teachers to do this and the struggles that they're having as they get into the classroom. So we hope that you will look up all the stories and email us and tell us what you think we should be focusing on next. We really value all of your feedback. So thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you.